In this video, I'm going to talk about the 19th century in dressage and why the French and the Germans are always like that with each other over it. It's all here coming up. Good stories to come and lots of enlightening stuff about their methods. If you like it, give us a thumbs up. Please subscribe. Tell a friend. All right, rockers, it is time for the 19th century in dressage and the old master stuff. This is the century in which the French and the German riding people really decide to go to war with each other. Not an actual war, although in the 1870s they do actually fight a war, France and Germany. But in terms of the philosophy of the horse. And what's silly about that is that actually they're both right, because they were both dealing with a different kind of horse that comes along and develops in this time period. But of course, you know, being men of great ego, they couldn't admit that, so they had to call each other poopy butt, poopy butt, poopy butt. No, you're right. No, I'm right, rather. You're right. And unfortunately, that has persisted to this day, which has, you know, the roots of a lot of the toxic culture that we have within dressage kind of goes back to this. But as I'm going to outline here, we shouldn't have to have any kind of fight because they're kind of all correct what they were on about, just depending what kind of horse you had. All right, so let's kick it off. What happens at the end of the 18th century? The French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité. And what that means is let's get rid of all that old stuff. Let's kill all those old aristocrats, or at least as many of them as we can get our hands on, except for the ones that, of course, become revolutionaries themselves in a clever way or go abroad and make their living elsewhere. And so a lot of the old dressage of people like François Baucher de la Guérinière, who is still the patron saint of dressage to this day, there was a bit of a rejection within France of this old stuff because it was associated with what they called the ancien régime, the old regime of all those bastards who, you know, starved us and, you know, extracted rents from us and did all those horrible things, and we chopped all their heads off with a guillotine. So the last thing we want to do is go back and train horses in their way. And so what happens is, although it actually does keep going on for a while, this type of training in France, there is a gradual move and then eventually a full rejection, which I'll get into. But during the French Revolution, a lot of French aristocrats go where? They go to their closest ally, and that's Austria. So I talked in the 18th century episode that we've got of the sort of Game of Thrones of classical dressage masters who all getting up to naughty stuff. There was a man called Adam von Weyrother who was running the Spanish riding school of Vienna around the same time in the mid 18th century when La Guérinière is writing, and he's bringing a lot of this stuff back over to the Spanish riding school, who were more at that time in the 17th century style, so they updated it. This grandson, Maximilian Ritter von Weyrother, Weyrother, for those of you who really want to nerd out, he then becomes the next head of the Spanish riding school. Meanwhile, his dads and uncles, Gottlieb and I think also a Max, were palling around with Mozart and people like this. So always an interplay between the general arts and the art of equitation. And so Max writes this book called Fragments. Fragments. This is very, very esoteric. And it's worth getting your hands on it and having a little look at it because it's basically La Guérinière. A little bit updated, and they begin to get a little bit more into the sort of realm of towards flying changes and things like that. But the idea is we're going to make a home for La Guérinière here in Vienna, while those French have gone crazy and are just like burning the whole thing down and are just rejecting everything. In 1822, I believe it is, the School of Versailles, the great French dressage temple, is actually officially closed. But in between, you have a dude called Napoleon. Ever heard of him? And he goes mad, and he says, we're going to take over the whole world, at least Europe anyway, and we're going to unite Europe, whether they like it or not. And his cavalry was very, very effective. And of course, they were all trained in that old La Guerinieri style. So Napoleon, even though he was part of, breaking up all that old traditional stuff, actually benefited from it because a lot of his big cavalry battles were won because of the really good training that they had left over from the old times. But this really starts to fragment once the Napoleonic Wars are over and the new monarchy is re-established, first under the old dudes, the Bourbons, who were the old family, and then the French go, well, yeah, maybe we'll actually have the Bonapartes, that's Napoleon's descendants, come back and we'll make them the royal family. What happens under that is, with the rejection of the old style of dressage, there's a kind of intellectualization. They feel they have to kind of reinvent it. And there is a dude who is still has a huge following today, and his name is Baucher. This is a guy called Racine writing about Baucher. Why have I got this book? Because it's actually a bit easier to understand what Baucher was on about through Racine's interpretation than it is when you read Baucher himself. Baucher is a bit difficult to read, like a lot of these French, a lot of these old dead dudes are. Xenophon Press. Xenophon Press. Shout out to the Xenophon Press. Thank you so much, guys, for publishing all this old dead dude stuff that in a way that is easy to read and affordable. Okay, cool. So Baucher comes along and he says, I can just reinvent the whole thing. Now, he was actually brought up in Versailles, and he for sure would have been actually steeped in and very, very familiar with the older classical traditions. So was he really reinventing anything, or was he just adding his spin? But what he reacted to, this is really interesting, is two things. One, the French were taking over North Africa at the time, and they needed a cavalry horse that could go long distances without water, was really up to hard work, but a bit bigger than an Arab horse to carry a French dude with all the equipment. So they invent the Anglo-Arab, because of course the British have been busy developing the thoroughbred horse for the last 100 years. So they add the thoroughbred to the Anglo-Arab, and they get a horse that can kind of go forever in the desert and is really, really hot and kind of good in a cavalry charge, but not terribly maneuverable and prone to kind of lose it in the head a little bit sometimes. And Baucher comes along and says, okay, we don't have the old types of Baroque horse easily available to us anymore. Remember, you couldn't just like ship horses up from Spain and Portugal in those days, not so easily anyway. And Spain and Portugal have really kind of receded a little bit, particularly after the Napoleonic Wars, because they just got devastated. Napoleon went in there and did terrible things, and then the Brits went in there, kicked Napoleon out, and at the end of it, Spain and Portugal are left kind of going, yeah, wow, lads, that was a bit of a rough go, wasn't it? So they sort of fall out of history a little bit. But of course, the bullfighting and all that stuff and the raising of cows and bulls on the haciendas and estancias, and then the courtly riding, it's all going on down there. We just don't have a whole lot of records of it. So we can assume they're great masters that we have yet to hear about coming out of there. So back to Baucher. He has this new type of horse. He says, okay, it's wiggly, it's hot, it kind of is a bit tricky. So what do we need to do? Maybe we need to get off the horse, put more of an emphasis on the in-hand work. The in-hand work had always been there, but he really kind of goes to town with the in-hand work. And he says if you do a lot of these patterns on the ground, it seems that you can kind of change the horse's brain. And then a lot of jaw flexions to take tension out of the horse. There's like 8,020 jaw flexions. We use them with our horses as well, but not 8,020 of them. We use like 2 or 3. And it seems that they're all the later ones are all sort of a bit similar to the earlier ones, but with their fingers crossed kind of thing. So there's different ones you can do with 4 reins, different ones you can do with 2 reins. We use them. And they do indeed chill horses out massively and get them to release the jaw, the underneck, flex over the back. Super cool stuff. And he had to do this because he had this chandelier fall on him like the Monty Python foot. So his first manner, which he wrote about, which was much more traditional, changes, and he writes in his second manner, about basically being a para rider at this point, how to take the tension out of these very hot, wiggly horses that were actually, frankly, a bit dangerous for him to ride. First the jaw flexions, then lots of in-hand work, then to the patterns with that Mr. Laguernière teaches us with shoulder in and renvers and so on. And then you seem to get a horse that changes its brain. We'll go into later why horses' brains get changed. We'll do that in another video, but it is very interesting, so hold that thought. And he then gets a horse that can go from its haunches to its shoulders, from its haunches to its shoulders, without tension. And then he can really use the massive athleticism of these Anglo-Arabs and thoroughbreds to do things like tempi changes. We owe the tempi changes to Mr. Baucher. So we owe him a lot, and we wouldn't have a Grand Prix test without him. So it's quite known that the Germans, at least the Germans who follow an older tradition, are quite anti-Baucher, but yet they do a Grand Prix test, right? So actually the Germans owe quite a lot to Baucher as well. But the problem with Baucher was twofold, and there are a couple of problems. One is that he himself said his method is not for every horse, and in certain horses, his way of lifting and then releasing the pole can lead to what he called the pigeon neck, which we would call overdevelopment of the underneck. He said not every horse makes it in his system, and he was having to produce horses for what was then called the circus, but it wasn't the circus in the way that we understand it. These were equestrian spectacular shows, similar perhaps to what you'd see in Cavalluna or Appassionata or Cavalier, these types of shows that go around. And he was like a star for the show for these guys. And so he had to come up with a way of continuing to wow the crowds while being a para rider. And he kind of figured it out. And these tempi changes and things, were very popular. So that's him. But as he said, not for everyone and not for every horse. Alongside him is a man called Phyllis, and Phyllis is actually English, but he makes his career in France and Russia, actually. And he is a contemporary of Baucher's, and he's using a lot of very, very similar techniques. So these guys really bring what they call the haute école, the high school riding, into the modern era. And you would still see a lot of this today in things like the School of Légèreté, Philippe Carl, etc. But it's not necessarily a universal. It seems to be something that makes a very, very, very good niche for a certain kind of horse, particularly the thoroughbreds and the Anglo-Arabs. But as Baucher himself said, it may or it may not end up being the thing for every horse and rider. Okay, but it is very, very good. So shout out to all those guys. Keep doing what you're doing. Now, at the same time in France, you've got a rise in what's called Anglomania. The thoroughbred horse racing, hunting, really takes off. The British Empire, the Industrial Revolution, England is being perceived as the kind of big economic winner of the time. And they've also come out on top after the Napoleonic Wars, etc. And so there is a real push within France to kind of ape the life of an English gentleman. And the man who's at the forefront of that is actually the chief of the cavalry school at Saumur. Some of you will have heard of Saumur and the Cadre Noir, who now put on very beautiful older type classical displays, more along the lines of Mr. Laguernière. But at the time, they were really moving weirdly away from that. And there was a count, the Count d'Aure, D-A-U-R-E, who was in charge of it at the time. And although he actually grew up with all the classical stuff, he then did a rejection. He said, no, we need something more naturalistic. And he really emphasized jumping, and but the jumping in the old style where you throw your body back and lift up the horse's head, and not terribly nice actually, but yet seemed to work. You see it in all those old hunting prints. The point being that in about 1822 and then from then onwards, the old school of Versailles is closed and the French basically abandon their old stuff. Baucher and Phyllis see the apogee of that French style of modernizing for the 19th century, the dressage, but after them it sort of starts to go whoop, and the riding of the Comte d'Aure then sets the stage for Caprilli to come along. Later on, we'll deal with him in the 20th century and say, ooh, that forward riding, yeah, it's actually kind of good, but this kind of back at your fences, yanking the horse in the mouth, that's not so good. Let's do something new with that. So hold on tight for Caprilli in the next video, the 20th century one that comes. Bottom line is the French kind of abandoned their dressage towards the end of the 19th century, with the exception of some of the real dyed-in-the-wool followers of Baucher, like a guy called Baudon and General de Haute and people like that. But the vast majority of riders, they kind of abandon it, sadly. But don't worry, they're going to find it again later on. So that's France around that time. Baucher is seen as a man of the modern age. We're abandoning the old, we're coming in with the new. So you really see how the political lines of the day follow the dressage. It's really interesting, isn't it? You know, La Guerinière seen as the bad old days, Baucher is like the good new days, and then they abandon it altogether and go off and start to ride quite badly for a while. Okay, now let's go to Germany. So around the time that Baucher is at the height of his fame, the German government actually, which is quite new, the unification of Germany starting to come in, they get interested in his stuff and they say, "Ooh, you know, the French are doing quite well down in their North African campaigns." They say, well, this Baucher dude, he's been training the French army. Now we maybe should get him in here to help us with ours. Roughly around this time, this is when Germany kind of becomes Germany and not just a fragmented thing of lots and lots of little principalities and states and so on. So they're reorganizing everything. And Baucher comes in and says, yeah, I'll help you guys out. And there is a big negative reaction from a man called Louis Seeger. And he writes an open letter to the riders of Germany. Don't touch Baucher. He's Satan. He's the devil. He's got horns coming out of his head. And I saw him last night dancing on the mountain with the devil I did. And he was... No, he didn't say that. But he did say you shouldn't do it because he's not riding his horse forward. And he's abandoning the principles of La Guerinière. He's a traitor. He's a traitor to his own country and his own traditions. And the horse got to go forward and stuff. Well, was he right or was he wrong? Baucher was clearly right in his context because he was getting great results, and the Germans to this day are doing the 1 times 10 piece, so hey. But Seeger was also right to a degree. And what he was saying is basically don't abandon what we know works. He's just being a bit overly grumpy about it. And also, I think where he had a point is that Baucher's stuff was relatively niche. Baucher himself, as I said earlier, said it's not for every horse, it's not for every rider. Whereas this older 18th century thing kind of is a bit more universal. But Seeger himself was dealing with a slightly new kind of horse. If you remember in our 18th century video, if you haven't watched it, go watch it because there's lots of cool stories in there. That's where the Trakehner horse really comes in. And the beginning of the warm blood. And so what is the warm blood? The warm blood is a horse that has a lot of carriage horse blood in it to build it up and get it big enough to carry big, tall German dudes around. And it itself wasn't necessarily a perfect dressage horse any more than the thoroughbred or the Anglo-Arab was. So the Germans start to tweak around with the old stuff because they're not riding Lusitanos anymore. And they realize that if this horse wants to go forward so much because it's been selectively bred to have a shoulder that pushes into the collar so it can pull the carriage, then you kind of have to let this juggernaut rumble forward, you know, and then begin to put it to the side, 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 until you can kind of get back to this. So Seeger was also right about the context of the kind of horse that they were starting to have in the early and mid 19th century in Germany. So really they shouldn't have been arguing. They should have said, well, you guys have these wiggly hot horses down there, and we've got these slightly heavier, rumbly, forwardy horses up here, and we've both figured out a way of kind of doing this with the modern horses at our disposal. Why don't we just go have a pint and, you know, be mates? But, you know, they couldn't do that. So a very good way to understand Baucher is either to read Racine or to read the great attack that comes from Seeger, because it's quite short, but he really goes into all of Baucher's stuff that he doesn't like. And he says, don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this, and don't do this. And like, oh, that. And so you read them and go, well, those actually sound quite interesting. Now, Seeger, though, in his book on Reitkunst, means the art of riding, riding art, is basically doing la guerinière. And he's writing about all sorts of things that la guerinière does, like also the work in the pillars and all of this stuff, which has kind of gone from the German tradition. And that's really interesting. So the Germans that got grumpy with the French got grumpy with them in the 19th century for abandoning the old 18th century stuff that you no longer really see in Germany. Isn't that cool? Well, isn't that interestingly cool? Because after Seeger, there's another dude who comes along who actually married Seeger's niece and was Seeger's student, and that is Gustav Steinbrecht. Now, if you go to Germany and you go to dressage circles in Germany, you say the name Steinbrecht, people will start, sacrificing animals to, and burnt offerings, I mean, in the good way, and saying, oh great Steinbrecht, we worship you. He is he is to the Germans what la guerinière is sort of to the Baroque classical world. What does Steinbrecht say he's doing? He says he's doing what la guerinière does. And we don't know with Steinbrecht if what we're reading from him is exactly his words or not, because it was published posthumously, and it was his notes that were put together by various editors, and they've gone through lots and lots and lots of editing. The thing that he's famous for saying, the most famous for saying, is straighten your horse and ride him forward, effectively. And so that has resulted in lots and lots of people in Germany going, you've just got to really, really ride your horse forward. And somehow, I don't quite know why, but it's been interpreted as you've got to ride forward with great force. But he doesn't really say that any more than this guy. It's just, forward just means not backwards, not sideways, and not standing still, just forward. Because you need this impulsion to do stuff with. Where this kind of roar thing came in, I'm not quite sure, but it's not really talked about in there. The other thing he says in there, and this is interesting in his earlier editions, is on day one, take your beginner pupil and put him on your best horse in piaffe, either in the pillars or in the long reins, so he can feel from get-go how it should feel. So if the god of German dressage is saying that, why isn't that being taught that way? Because it's not, it's gone. Why? Where's it gone? Where's it evaporated to? Fortunately, there are still places in the world which will teach that way. This guy, La Guerinière, talks that you have to do that as well. Put the people on these schoolmaster horses in the piaffe so that they can feel it from day one. And we've taken that very seriously with our Helios Harmony program. If you come and ride with us, that's exactly what we'll do. We'll put you up there in piaffe and passage day one so you can feel how it feels. But there's also, a few other places around the world with these schoolmasters, notably the Valenza family and others who will do it too. And it really is worth it, because if these dudes are saying that it's a good idea, it's probably a good idea. Okay, so Steinbrecht also talks about, though, the need for a horse that feels good. And also that the seat and the way the rider sits and looks should not be something rigid. You shouldn't sit there like this. You should, try to be in balance with your horse. But he does say that the ugly English hunting rider, he sort of says it looks a bit ugly, is actually more in tune with his horse than the average stiff German of his day. So, and this actually ties in with, if we go all the way back to the beginning, and Max von Weyrother, he talks about you need to be a reflective rider. His grandfather said you need to be a thinking rider. He says you need to be a reflective rider. You need to be humane. You need to have respect for the horse. You need to think of the horse's welfare. You need to think about the horse's physical and emotional needs. That's back way at the beginning, like during the Napoleonic Wars. And it seems that Steinbrecht is really actually building on this as well. He says, don't be rigid, don't hold your horse in. be soft, be nice. But yes, we are looking for collection, and we are wanting to do what this guy tells us to do, but we do have this slightly new type of horse. All right, so that is kind of the 19th century. It leaves us with France and Germany looking at each other going, and the French actually largely abandoning dressage altogether. And by the time you get to the Franco-Prussian War, the sort of last big conflict between France and Germany, one of the things that happens is the German cavalry does come in and actually decimate the French cavalry at that point, which is the complete opposite as what happened at the beginning of the 19th century, where the French cavalry were to some degree unbeatable because they were still sort of following what this guy said. When they stopped doing that, it didn't work so well. And that kind of is true of the English too. Our cavalry really declined in effectiveness after we abandoned dressage in favour of really fun stuff like fox hunting. It is fun, and I love it. I do it, but I only do the bloodless kind. I do not do the blood E kind. But nonetheless, if you think back to the 18th century, our previous video, you have guys like von Seydlitz in Prussia talking about the importance of horses that can jump, horses that can hunt, and that this is mixed with the dressage. And this is sort of going on within the German mind into the late 19th century as well. And this, of course, sets the scene for sport riding, which is about to come in with eventing, show jumping, and sport dressage in the beginning of the 20th century, in which the Germans will begin to dominate. The French hold their own for a while, and then the Germans are going to kind of knock them out. And then, of course, everyone else learns how to do it that German way, and the playing field begins to level out. But one of the problems we know as sport riding begins to take hold is that there are some costs to the horse involved in that. And it's also not for every rider, because not every rider wants to ride competitively. But this is all coming in the 20th century video, where we're going to look at people like Caprilli, and then we're going to go into great masters like Nuno Oliveira and von Neindorf, Rainer Klimke, and others. Now, but what you'll see with that name Oliveira, that is when finally Iberia comes back into the scene, where it all began with their amazing horses and Nuno Oliveira, who rationalizes everything and says, listen, you Frenchies and you Germanies, you're both right, and we need to just use a rational amount of Baucher if we've got a thoroughbred, and a rational amount of Steinbrecht if we've got a warm blood, and then we need to bring it all back to La Guerinière, and he proves it. So does von Neindorf. We'll go into that in the next video. So, rockers, if you liked it, we mentioned a lot of old dead dudes here, didn't we? I even forgot, oh my lord, the very, very early guy, Hunersdorf from Hessen, who sort of is the link from the La Guerinière age into the Seeger age. We'll stick him in there with Max von Weyrother. But we've got all these dudes, him, Seeger, Baucher, Phyllis, the Comte d'Or, Steinbrecht. If you want any more stories about these guys, we can go into much deeper detail. And of course, I'm going to be teaming up with Richard Williams, who is the publisher of Xenophon Press, and himself a very, very accomplished dressage trainer in his own right. And he has edited and re-edited these texts, so he knows them really well. And we're going to do a series on the masters, interpreted by him, and how he uses them in his training, which I think you all will find quite useful. Again, if you guys feel like you want to come down and ride our ponies with us and explore some of this stuff actually with a horse on it or next to it, do get in touch with us. Helios Harmony.com. You can also find it on longridehome.com, the Helios Harmony program. Most important, please like and subscribe. It's good to get this information out there. Comment below if there's other stuff you'd like us to cover. Tell a friend. See you on the next one.